they traveled in a motion that he compared to saucers being skipped on water, which is kind of an unusual analogy, but that name stuck, and that's why they became flying saucers.
The sighting has become celebrated as the moment the flying saucer age was born. It sparked a frenzy of public excitement, but it was a frenzy fueled by paranoia, because this was the start of the Cold War.
This coalition was to be torn asunder.
The allies of the Second World War were now enemies.
Already an iron curtain had dropped around Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria.
In public, West and East mounted huge displays of their biggest and best military hardware. But there was a secret war too, a ruthless competition to acquire Nazi science and Nazi scientists.
Whoever controlled this technology after World War II would really be ahead militarily. So there was a scramble between the Allied powers, the Russians, the French, the British, even though they had been allies, to obtain as much of this technology as possible for their own side.
And that's why the US government was so alarmed by the saucers seen by pilot Kenneth Arnold. As this secret document shows, it meant Russia had acquired German flying saucer technology and was building them.
The Germans had been so far in advance of the United States, they thought that if the Russians had captured scientists or installations responsible for these secret weapons, that maybe the Soviets were now ahead too.
The Americans were right. The Russians were building saucers, and to help them, they'd spirited someone very useful from Germany, Andreas Epp, the German saucer engineer.
Immediately after the war, Andreas Epp decided that he wanted to work in the Soviet Union. So he moved to Rostock and was contacted there by Soviet agents. And the Soviet agents seemed to know who he was. And of course, Epp liked this a lot because somebody was acknowledging that he actually was of some value, and whereas before he had been minimized.
I thought to myself, I have to carry on. I owe it to the people who worked on it. And I started to build a flying disc.
Epp worked primarily on the steering mechanism of the Soviet saucer.
His specialty was the guidance part of this type of saucer. In other words, making it respond to controls, linking the controls to the saucer movements itself.
According to Epp, the Russian saucer was extraordinarily maneuverable, but it was also versatile, and it had to be.
It was a jet, and they wanted something that they could use, interestingly enough, in polar regions.
The reason for that was obvious. The quickest way to North America was over the pole. That was a fact not lost on an increasingly paranoid America. Even Hollywood suspected the Russians were up to something sorcerous.
Now, the first country that learns the secret of the flying saucer will control the skies of the world. I don't want that country to be Russia.
A lot of the sightings were in the northwest part of the United States. It was near the Boeing plant in Seattle, where all of the U.S. bombers were built. And it was also near the Hanford nuclear reservation in Washington State, where the plutonium for the nuclear bombs was produced. They were very strategically sensitive parts of the United States, and it was the closest part of the United States to the Soviet Union. So it's where they would have expected Soviet planes to come.
By now, saucers were appearing everywhere. Hardly a city centre or movie set was safe. The government needed to put a lid on the speculation. And to do that, their psychological warfare experts came up with an elegant two-part plan. First, a senior military figure would firmly deny that anything was happening at all, but as a backup, they'd set rumours flying that the saucers came from outer space.
I delivered the message. Now.
The plan was launched at a press conference in the Pentagon. It was July 1952, and a definitive moment in the history of spin.
This is Major General John A. Samford, Director of Intelligence, United States Air Force, who conducted the conference.
Samford's job was to deny there was anything significant about the reported sightings.
It does not contain any pattern of purpose or of consistency that we can relate to any conceivable threat to the United States.
To argue the alien invader theory, they put a pulp magazine writer, retired Major Donald Keyhoe, on the same platform as the Major.
Major Keyhoe, as author of the book Flying Saucers Are Real, what is your opinion of these new sightings of unidentified objects?
With all due respect to the Air Force, I believe that some of them will prove to be of interplanetary origin.
It was very clever and very simple. Now, anyone who saw a military saucer would be encouraged to believe they'd seen an alien.
It was about 40 feet long,
and the rest of us would laugh at them.
I saw it for so many minutes that I can't deny what I saw.
The press loved the alien story and ran it with enthusiasm. The very edition of Life magazine, which launched Marilyn Monroe as a star, also launched the career of many a monster from Mars.
In that article, a number of anonymous government and military experts were interviewed and made statements supporting the idea that the saucers could not be man-made objects, secret weapons, or misidentified natural phenomena. So the alternative seemed to be that they were from another planet.
Never before has the screen reached such heights of excitement, breathtaking spectacle.
Donald Keyhoe's writings directly inspired the most classic saucer movie, Earth vs. the Flying Saucers, made by legendary Hollywood animator Ray Harryhausen.
The basic concept was taken from one of his books about flying saucers. I understand that the government has made a lot of experiments with round flying objects, and which they kept quiet, and so they probably encouraged the idea that they were aliens from outer space.
Indeed, it appears the government was so interested that the film's producer, Charles Schneer, was reporting directly to them.
Of course, after the script is finished, it's out of my hands, and I'm sure that Charles submitted it to the front office as well as to various space people.
Budniks and Mudniks flying through the air.
But while American citizens looked to the skies with varying degrees of concern, the men in black were looking closer to home. They were desperate for their own saucers, and just like the Russians, they were looking for former Nazi scientists to help them.
When the Nazis surrendered in 1945, the U.S. military was worried about the German scientists falling into the hands of the Soviets, and the U.S. military was also interested in exploiting the knowledge of these scientists to help develop American programs like missiles and electronics, radar, supersonic aerodynamics, jet engines, and other advanced technologies that the Germans had developed. So the United States set up a program called Overcast and Paperclip to collect these scientists and bring them to the United States.
In some respects, the Americans did very well. They snatched Nazi technology boss Werner von Braun and made him into an invaluable member of the American war machine. They also acquired a great deal of German V-2 rocket technology. But while they played with these new toys with rather more enthusiasm than skill, they knew there was a serious gap in their new armory. They had no German saucers. Then, one day in 1957, they had a stroke of luck. And once again, it involved the German saucerman Andreas Epp, now living in East Germany.
At some point, he had a falling out with life in Eastern Germany. I don't know what it was. It may have been a divorce. Anyway, he ended up in the West, and he crossed the border then and said, "Hi, here I am. I was spying for the Soviets, and I want to tell you everything I know." And the Americans immediately threw him in jail and began interrogating him. And while he was in jail, he started writing and drawing from memory what he had done for the Soviets, the Soviet saucer plan, and what it was going to be used for.
With the help of Epp and others, America's saucer program began in earnest.
It's an interesting fact that by the late 50s and early 60s, almost all the major aerospace contractors, including Boeing, Convair, Lockheed, North American, were working on concepts for saucer-shaped vehicles for various applications.